Anthony, thank you very much for joining me today and taking the time to talk to me. Now, you were a very popular meteorologist, and to the point actually that when I was on the bus coming in here yesterday, I had a bus driver, when I told him that I was interviewing you, she said to me, please tell him from me that we want him back on air. So there's a message from one of the locals. You actually won Best Local Personality, and back in the day when you were on air. Now, you created the Surface Stations Project. Right. You're a signatory to the Manhattan Declaration. You're an editor of your own personal blog, which has actually become one of the biggest in the world on the subject of climate change. There's a lot to talk about. So let's just rewind a little bit and go back to the beginning. 1990, you were working as a weatherman, and you describe yourself in 1990 as having been fully engaged in the belief that CO2 was the root cause of the global warming problem. Clearly that's not the case now. So what had you convinced of that? Why were you fully engaged in that? What changed your mind, and where do you stand now?
It all goes back to June of 1988 when Dr. James Hansen addressed Congress, and he made his famous presentation of 3 scenarios. And I watched that. I actually watched it live coming down the feed in my television station. We were in the control room there, and I was watching this coming down the feed and watching via satellite. And I thought that that was really an extraordinary presentation that he had given at that time, and it said to me, well, we really need to do something. It's at that point now where we need to really take some action. And he had convinced me fully at that point, as he did many people. And I mulled on that for a couple of years. And I'd always wondered, well, what could I do as a television meteorologist in a relatively small town to make a difference? And I came up with an idea, and the idea was based on carbon sequestration. Obviously, trees sequester carbon, they produce oxygen, they do all kinds of beneficial things for our life. And so I thought perhaps I would come up with a way to get more trees planted. And I approached the National Arbor Day Foundation in Lincoln, Nebraska. I flew out there and met with the president, John Rosenow, and I pitched a program to him that basically would provide other television meteorologists with ways to talk about the issue. And we proposed a program called Arbor Day Weather Week, in which I would send a series of graphics that would describe the problem and what can be done about it, how to plant trees, how to get trees, the benefits and so forth. And we would send these down to the affiliate stations via satellite feed in the week surrounding Arbor Day leading up to Earth Day. Right. And we did this in 1990, and we had several hundred television stations participating. We planted about 250,000 trees that year, according to the National Arbor Day Foundation, because people, after viewing it, could write in to the Arbor Day Foundation, pay a small fee for shipping, and have some seedlings sent to them, some Colorado blue spruce seedlings. And based on their demand, they estimated about 250,000 were planted. So that was very fulfilling for me, and we did that for 1990 and 1991, and then the Arbor Day Foundation decided to go in a different direction, do some different things. And I still had that in the back of my mind and still was thinking about it, but it wasn't until around 1995, 1996 that I started to think differently. And the reason I started thinking differently was because of a friendship that I struck up with the former climatologist, the state climatologist of California, James Goodridge, who had retired here to Chico. And he started doing some work on temperature data. He was very close to all the weather stations in California. He knew them all. And he knew that there were problems, and he started looking at the data, and he published a small paper in the American Meteorological Society Bulletin in 1996 that showed how different populations affected the temperature differently. He had a very profound graph that had 3 lines on it. And the first line showed California counties of less than 1 million population, and it was almost flat. And then there was another line that showed between 500,000 and 1 million, and it was different. And then there was the one where there was most populated counties, like Los Angeles County, San Francisco, and so forth, and it was much sharper. And I said to myself, well, wait a minute. How can CO2 heat counties differently? It can't. It's not an intelligent molecule. And so that was when I began to question that, well, maybe the data isn't quite as supportive of the theme as once thought. And that was really the changing point for me. And it evolved further after that.
Well, you've spent a great deal of time on your blog and in your professional life analysing data. So that seems that's where it started, but that's also where it's continuing today for you. You invest a great deal of energy and a great deal of time into looking at the data. Now, I want to jump ahead a little bit to exactly that, seeing as we're there right now. you're best known publicly for your blog, and blogs and bloggers have played a huge role in the entire climate debate, particularly in the last 10 years. And so some very significant things have been discovered by various bloggers and by various people like yourself, working away at a computer, analysing data and coming to conclusions. You launched the Surface Stations project. Now, I guess in the context of what you've just said, that this was the very beginning of your doubting the orthodoxy of anthropogenic global warming, that makes sense that you would then launch a project like Surface Stations. What was Surface Stations? What did you find? And what's been the fallout from that?
The project originally started out completely unrelated to its current form. Serendipity kicked in. And where it kicked in was I was originally interested in something that I learned in college. One of my first projects when I worked as a research assistant at the meteorology department at Purdue University was to assemble a Stevenson screen. That's these white boxes with slats that they put thermometers in that have been around since around 1890. It was the standardized exposure for a thermometer. And I had to assemble one of these as a student there, as a research assistant. And I was assembling it, and the paint was coming off in my hands. And I was looking at it, and I'm thinking, what's wrong with this paint? And so I went to my professor, and I said, this paint's coming off in my hand. Why is that? I mean, can I repaint this with something better? And he says, no, don't touch it. It's been that way since the beginning. And I said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, it's whitewash. Whitewash? Who uses whitewash in this day and age? Well, he said, when the Weather Bureau put together the project for a nationwide monitoring system, which gradually then expanded to the world in 1890, that was the specification for the paint, whitewash, because that's all they had then. Latex paint, lead paint, all these things didn't exist. And so they kept that specification all through that time. And if you change the paint, you're going to change the measurement characteristics of the shelter. Oh, all right. Well, the problem with that is that that whitewash, it comes off in my hands, also comes off in weather and rain and everything else, and you had to repaint those things every year with new whitewash. And finally, in 1979, this was about 1975 that I discovered this, 1979, the Weather Service changed the specification to latex because the maintenance issues were so great. And I'd often wondered, well, what effect did that have? Because I never saw any study on it. And it had been in the back of my mind for a long time. And so I finally had some free time around the year 2006, about the time I started my blog, and I'd talked about this with Jim Goodridge, and we'd wanted to do an experiment, but we never got around to it. So I had time, I had a blog, I thought, why not do this experiment and find out what effect the paint has? Well, I started doing that. I did some tests on different painted slats and so forth, but then I thought I'd better really go around and make sure that these weather stations had been repainted, you know, if that's true or not. So I did that, and the first station I visited at the Chico State University farm had a radio transmitter to transmit automatic temperature data back to the Weather Service office within about 4 inches of the temperature sensor. And you and I both know electronics creates heat, and so why would you put a piece of electronics next to a temperature sensor? It was just mind-boggling to me, and I thought, strange. And then I went to another station in Orland, California, and everything was normal, everything was well done, and I thought, well, the first thing was just a fluke. Then I visited Marysville, California, and discovered that they had converted to the newer MMTS style of electronic thermometer rather than the box of slats, the Stevenson screen. But it was in the middle of a parking lot, literally. There was a station there that had the temperature sensor literally right in the middle of the parking lot, and just a few feet away were some air conditioning heat exchanger units, and I could stand there and feel warm air blowing on me while I'm looking at this thing. And I said to myself, wait a minute, this is where we're measuring climate? This was an official climate monitoring station for the United States. Sanctioned, approved, stamped, great, it's perfect. They're using this data for climate monitoring, and I'm seeing it in the middle of a parking lot, and I've got air blowing on me from air conditioners. This can't be right. So now I had 2 out of 3 stations that I'd visited in a short radius that had problems. And I thought to myself, there must be a bigger problem here than paint. And that's what got it started. A survey had never been done like this of the quality of the measurement environment of these stations. And as any scientist can tell you, if you don't maintain quality control through an experiment, your experiment ends up being garbage because the data is just all over the map. And so it surprised me that this hadn't been done, and I started to seek out where could I find more information on this. I discovered Dr. Roger Pielke Sr. at the University of Colorado. He had done a small-scale study in Colorado and found some similar things. I called him up. We had a profound conversation comparing what we'd found. And I said, you know, this really needs to be done on a national scale. And he said, well, it's never been done and no one wants to fund it. It's just not viable, and a whole bunch of things. And I thought, well, I have a blog, and maybe we could get a volunteer group to do it. And so that's what happened. And so we put together a technique, him and I, to allow volunteer surveyors to do this project. And what we found was, in British parlance, gobsmacking. About 80% of the United States network was severely compromised in one way or another. If you include all the stations that we looked at, almost 90%. Basically 1 in 10 were what were considered good by the Weather Service's own siting standards. So this was just a qualitative analysis, not a quantitative analysis. So the next phase came to do it quantitatively. And of course, I had no funding for this. This is all volunteer, and so it's taken a very long time. But we've now finally got into the quantitative phase, and we've discovered that siting does in fact have an effect, and that effect can amount to almost half of the temperature trend in the last 30 years.
Let me just ask you a couple of questions on how you got your volunteers to help, because I kind of want to double check the quality of the work itself. The people who are actually checking these weather stations for you, they were bloggers, they were readers of your blog. How do you know that their work was actually quality work? Were they sending you photographs? Were they sending you descriptions? How did you assess, because you haven't been to them yourself?
Well, we knew that there would be errors based on the volunteers out there. I mean, no public survey is ever perfect. And so we had our own quality control going on in the background, where we would double check what they had found. We'd compare it against what we knew as far as the database that that Noaa provided, and we would use that to determine whether or not it was a valid survey or not. And so quality control was a big part of that, to make sure that it had been done. And we had to actually redo probably a few dozen stations because they were either done incorrectly, incompletely, or they got the wrong station. Early on in the project, the metadata that was provided by Noaa was so poor that we often got the wrong station in town because they had never even flagged in their own database whether this was an official climate monitoring station or not. And so there might be 2 of them in town, one of them for hydrometeorological purposes, for measuring rainfall, and temperature was kind of just a throwaway. And then there was the climate station, and they looked identical in terms of equipment, and people would get them mixed up. Yeah. And so, yeah, it took a while to get that sorted out, but now we have a very strong handle on that, and we believe we have a strong database that shows quality metadata for the United States.
Okay. I actually live just down the road from a climate measuring station in Melbourne, which happens to be on the corner of a 4-lane each-way arterial road with a skyscraper on one side of it and a large sort of a service station type building not that far away.
That's
as
the
well.
one with the big skyscraper on one side, and it's the V-shaped
That's right,
street.
yes, the V-shaped street.
And there's the park on the other side.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, you're obviously familiar with that one. So I walk past that one a couple of times a week, and even before I began really understanding the sorts of things that we're talking about now, even as a teenager, I've lived in Melbourne most of my life, I used to see that and wonder about the wind speed readings. The temperature didn't cross my mind back then, but how can you get an accurate wind speed reading that is in any way representative of an area when you're wedging your wind sensor into the gap between two buildings? It makes no sense. So to me, I understand a lot of what you're saying. Now, there was a lot of criticism though. A lot of people came back and said that your work was either incomplete or inaccurate. A lot of people were very unhappy with the conclusions that you drew. Mm-hmm. So you've responded to that. Just talk me through that.
Well, within about 2 weeks of us starting the project, we actually had our very first response from Noaa, and that was they closed the database that we were using to verify the stations. And we were just stunned that they would do this. And their concern was that we were violating the privacy of these observers, because you got to understand that the Network for Monitoring Climate in the United States is not a homogeneous, same set of instruments done the same way in the same procedure. It is a volunteer organization. Some of it is official stations down at airports. Some of it is at police and fire stations. Some of it is at backyards of private observers. Right. It is literally a mishmash of volunteerism. And the reason that there's more police and fire stations is because those are manned 24/7, and they needed someone to actually go out and read the thermometer and write it down. Yeah. And so that was before the advent of electronic thermometers. Yeah. So it's very mishmashy. And so that we were getting blowback saying, well, you're out there tramping in people's backyards, you're violating their privacy, and it's just wrong, and all that sort of thing. And I said, well, no, we're only interested in what the station looks like. We don't care about where they live, what their name is, or anything of that nature. And I pointed out to them, the Noaa people, you publish a quarterly newsletter where you publish pictures of those volunteer observers standing in their own backyards in front of their station with their name, with their address, with their city, with their 50-year or 25-year or 10-year service plaque, standing there grinning, and you're worried about me violating their privacy? I don't think so. We successfully argued and got that database restored within about a week of them taking off, and we haven't had problems since then. But then people said, well, you've got a volunteer organization, you're going to end up with garbage data and so forth. And there was a valid criticism. So we worked very hard to work on quality control. But it took us a very long time. Remember, it's just me and some volunteers. There's no funding, there's no deadline, there's no expectations in terms of like you have to perform. So it took us a very long time to get all of it done. And we encountered people that just wouldn't talk to us. We had people that would tell us after we had done the survey that we don't want the station included after all, and things of that nature. And so we had to sort through all those things. In the process, I started publishing a status report. And that status report went out about every month to show which stations we'd surveyed. It was not in any way intended to be quality control data. It was just a status report. Noaa decided that they were going to preempt me and use that status report as a basis to run their own paper and get it out before mine. Right. And they told me they were going to do this and wanted me to sign on to the paper. And I said, no, I'm not going to do it because this is not quality controlled data yet. We hadn't finished the process. We hadn't finished the survey. We only had 33% of the network sampled. It was still clumpy in places. We hadn't got a good distribution. There's all kinds of issues with the data. And they said, well, we're going to go ahead anyway. And they went ahead because they were getting so much criticism as to the quality of the siting. How can you let this happen? You know, how can you do a quality assessment of the nation's climate with such a mishmash of stations? And so they were getting all kinds of public relation hits. And so they went ahead and published their paper. And of course, I was upset about it, but we continued on with our project. And we have now surveyed almost every station in the United States. There are still a few that we're never going to get because they're either on private property where people are not going to let us in, or they're on airports where we can't get to that particular location. So most of the stations we're either able to get on the ground or by aerial surveys now, which has improved greatly. And so we're now at the point where we're going to publish a paper on this. Now, we had published a preliminary paper last year. It went out. There were some criticisms, valid criticisms, that we're now addressing. It's taken us a year to do that. But we believe we found a ground truth, and that ground truth is that siting matters, and it affects the temperature trend over the last 30 years by as much as 50%. The surface temperature record trend, if you were to use what we call the best station, the class 1s and 2 stations, the ones that have not been affected by need for time of observation bias and so forth, if you look at their trend compared to the rest of them, it's about half of what Noaa produces. And so, yeah, you could say that Noaa almost doubles what we consider to be the real temperature signal.
Now, Anthony, you made a statement which, if I can paraphrase, went along the lines of a lot of the solutions being proposed by politicians and scientists and so forth are not actually going to solve the problem as they see it. There's a lot of people convinced that global warming is a serious issue, that we do need to take action, but you're not convinced that even the actions that they're proposing are actually going to achieve their goals. So what are the sorts of things that you're seeing proposed, and what did you mean by saying that it wasn't actually going to make the difference that they're proposing?
Well, to understand this, you have to kind of go back to how it's being presented and how the presentation to the public is different from the reality of what's actually going on in the atmosphere. The way that it's presented, the global warming problem, is presented very simply, and that is you put stuff in the atmosphere and it causes it to get warmer. And that's basically what most people understand. They get that about just that much of it. It's also presented in a linear fashion, that if you put more CO2 in the atmosphere, it's going to go up like this. You're going to get a linear temperature increase. But that's not the case at all. We're in a dynamic system here that is chaotic. And so, you know, from year to year, we have fits and starts of temperature that go up and down. And so there is no true linear trend there. But they say, well, if you take all that and get rid of the noise, that is still a true linear trend. Well, not exactly. As we've seen in the last 15 years, that trend has slowed significantly, even though CO2 has continued to go up. And part of this has to do with the fact that the response of CO2 in the atmosphere, the back radiation that it causes, the warming back and the slowing of the transfer of heat to the top of the atmosphere, is a logarithmic effect. It's not linear. It's curved like this. And it's curved, and we are almost at the top of the curve. Being at the top of the curve, there's very little room for improvement as we go along. Changes to the amount of CO2, a doubling of CO2, won't make that much more difference in temperature. Reducing CO2 won't make that much more difference in temperature. Most of the effect is at the sharp lower end of the curve at the lower concentrations. And so we're fighting a problem that is kind of like fighting Sisyphus. You know, you keep rolling that ball up the hill and it rolls back on you. That's kind of that way with CO2. It is not something that you can get a lot of return for a massive amount of output for. A way to kind of make this personal to understand it is how we taste things. If we were to taste CO2 in the atmosphere and it's close to saturation point where it gets up at the top of the curve, it would be like salting soup. You're served a bowl of soup at a restaurant. You put it in front of you, you taste it, and it's a little bland. So you decide you're going to salt it some to give it some taste. You taste it again and you think, well, that's better, but you want some more salt in it. So now you put salt in it a second time and you've accidentally put too much salt in it and you taste it and it's too salty. Now, no matter how much more salt you put into it, it's still going to taste too salty. Your taste buds' response to the salt is saturated. Our atmospheric response to carbon dioxide is almost saturated at the top of that curve. And so there's very little to gain from changing those concentrations at the point we're at. And that's the problem.
The IPCC, who are one of the most respected bodies when it comes to climate science and regarded by many as the authority, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they claim that, well, at a basic level, doubling CO2 will increase the temperature by approximately 1 degree, thereabouts. However, that there's actually a feedback loop that then increases that beyond that point, anywhere from 2.5 or 3 degrees through to possibly as high as 6 degrees. What do we know about these feedback loops? What are they basing that on, and is that true?
The biggest one is that they're claiming water vapor is going to cause a positive feedback. And initially, the way models were running, it looked like that might be true, that the more heat we put into the atmosphere, the more water vapor is going to get lifted into the atmosphere, and therefore, because water vapor is a potent greenhouse gas, more potent than CO2, it's going to cause more warming, which will cause more water vapor to be evaporated, and it's an endless cycle. And it's from that premise that some people said we would go into a runaway warming scenario. We'd reach a tipping point. But recent studies, and of course the recent nature of the weather, has shown us in the last 15 years that the climate sensitivity doesn't seem to be all that high, and that maybe those feedbacks aren't quite as strong, or maybe they're of the wrong sign. And so there are people now doing studies that are showing, and there's a number of people, professional climate scientists, getting on board with this, that the climate sensitivity may be closer to around 1 degree centigrade or even less, depending upon how you model it. And nature is working to demonstrate that as well. We haven't seen any significant warming in the past 15 years, and it's going on 17 almost. And what happens when we get up to 20 years? Then what? That's the question. And so climate sensitivity might be reduced. You got to remember, the Earth has been through all kinds of trials and tribulations over its history. It has been through, comet impacts. It's been through giant fires, volcanism, all kinds of things. And it keeps itself balanced. It'll get out of whack for a brief period of time, but it has a balancing mechanism built in. The atmosphere balances itself, and it works in conjunction with the biosphere. And so right now, we're putting lots of carbon in the air. The biosphere is actually getting better. If you look at some of the data from NASA's sea whiffs, they show that we had a tremendous greening of the planet, and they attribute it to CO2. And that's a positive thing. And I find it almost hypocritical that a lot of the Greens don't like the greening of the planet going on from CO2.
All right. You've been on speaking tours to Australia amongst other places. You are probably one of the most high-profile skeptics in terms of, you mentioned your name in polite company, and a lot of people come out with very interesting reactions. You're not a popular man in some circles. What actually made you decide to enter the fray, as it were? It's one thing to hold a skeptical view on anthropogenic global warming. It's another thing to end up where you are with one of the world's most read blogs on the subject. So why did you actually decide to engage with this issue to such a degree?
Well, I didn't actually set out to do that. It was an accident. I started my blog in November of 2006 as a general purpose science blog under the wing of the local newspaper. they had asked for some local citizens to write blogs. And I volunteered, and I wrote about general science for a while, and it wasn't until I did my pain experiment that things started shifting off into the climate realm. And it just gained momentum, and then it got more momentum, and it got bigger. And all of a sudden, then I had to change platforms to get to a bigger platform. And it gained momentum because people were interested in it. Not because I went after it with some kind of a cause, or I'm going to prove, or something of that nature. It just kept getting bigger and bigger. And so when it keeps getting bigger, you can't really ignore it. You have to deal with it. And so that's how it got started, and how I ended up. And then Climategate happened, and that put me into the center of things. I mean, I was ground zero for Climategate. We knew about Climategate for 3 days before we released it on the blog, and we were very careful about it because we didn't know what we had. And so once Climategate happened, I went from being popular in a circle of people that had interest to being internationally known. And so again, serendipity kicked in there and made it even bigger. So
what was Climategate?
Well, Climategate was a release of emails in November of 2009 from the Climate Research Unit at East Anglia University. And these emails contained private conversations between climate scientists. They're not actually private because they were done on public funds at public universities, but they thought that they were private. And they were being resisted by FOIA attempts. They wouldn't release these things. And they showed that they weren't very sure about certain things. They're one of the most famous one by Kenneth Trenberth said that, you know, it's a travesty that we can't account for the warming right now. And it's because they didn't know why it had slowed. And they had questions about paleoclimatology, some of the hockey stick stuff, the tree rings. All these things were being questioned privately. And what it showed was that there was almost a Janus kind of a presentation with climate science, where you had the two-phase presentation. Privately, they were talking in one face. Publicly, they were talking in another face. And that's what Climategate exposed.
Mm. And you were one of the core people who was involved in.
Right. I was given the file, and we sat on it for 3 days while we figured out whether or not it was real. We were concerned it was a trap. I was traveling in Europe at the time. I was afraid I'd be stopped at customs for having it in my possession. There were all kinds of concerns. And it wasn't until I got back into the United States that I decided to release it. Literally, right past the customs line at Dulles Airport. As soon as I got out of customs, I sat down at the gate for my plane going to California, and I wrote that first blog post, and I called up some people ahead of time. I called an attorney, I called a consultant, I called people to find out, am I doing the right thing, what are the risks, and so forth. And literally, like 30 seconds before my plane is supposed to leave, I hit the publish button and got on the plane, and then sat there on the plane for 5 hours, unable to do nothing, wondering, what have I done? And so that's what Climategate, how I became the center of that.
Mm. Now, as a result of your position now within the world of climatology, you've become aware of probably more than just about anyone else in terms of what's going on, the predictions that have been made by climatologists, whether or not those predictions have come true. You would have a wealth of information. So talk me through a little bit. I've looked at the blog, and I've gone through the blog in research for this interview. And one of the common themes that seems to be there are a lot of articles about and scientific papers showing that the predictions made, the things that were predicted to happen as a result of climate change, aren't happening. So can you talk me through what are some of the big things that have been predicted while you've been a blogger, while you've been involved in this, that have not come to pass?
The biggest is the 3 scenarios that James Hansen predicted when he put it in front of Congress in June 1988. He had these 3 different scenarios of different kinds of emissions of CO2. And what's happened is that the observation, the actual temperature, hasn't kept up with these predictions that were done in 1988. There's a divergence between these. And the divergence continues to get greater as time goes on. And that's what the climate scientists are unable to explain right now. Why is this slowdown happening? Why is there this divergence? Now, attached to that, there were a whole set of ancillary scenarios, like we're going to lose the Arctic sea ice. There's a prediction in place for this summer, 2013, that says 2013 will be ice-free for the first time. Below 1 million kilometers is what they consider the threshold. Well, it doesn't look like that's going to happen right now. And it may at some point in time, but we've also seen from anecdotal evidence in the past, like 1922, that there were shrinkages of Arctic ice. And what caused that back then? And so there's a mode out there right now to try to attribute virtually any kind of weather, any kind of a change in our status quo of the Earth to climate change in some way. And so a lot of predictions are made just a few years out. And then they get closer to those predictions and then they discover, well, that's not quite working out. We need to revise it, and they move it further. And it's just constantly moving goalpost that keeps getting further and further out. So a lot of these predictions haven't come to pass. And yet they're still being considered by revising them. And that's part of the problem. They keep it in the mindset of the public. The public doesn't have the wherewithal to double check these things sometimes. They look at photographic evidence, they see glaciers receding, but then again, they don't go look at the history back in 1922, things like that. And so it becomes almost a public relations issue as opposed to a science issue related to these types of claims. And they need to be dealt with in such a way that the public can understand them. And that's part of the problem with climate science. It is a very, very complex thing. And some parts of it you can present very simply, but when you present it simply, you don't look at the bigger picture of the fact that we live in a dynamic system that is chaotic, hard to predict, and it does things without our expectations being met. We figure it's going to do this, and it does this. And so how do you reconcile climate science with those kinds of things? And the answer is you can't.
As best as we can tell, looking into proxy records and historical records of temperature throughout history, what are some of the extremes that we've seen throughout history, going back as far as you like? What are some of the variations in the climate that we've seen through ice ages and warm periods and so forth?
Well, obviously the biggest change in climate the Earth has experienced is the ice ages. And those are the real things we have to worry about. Now, we have changes in the precession of our orbit of our planet that are going to bring about ice ages according to Milankovitch theory. And when that happens, we're going to see ice sheets going across the northern latitudes and advancing south. You can't get a city out of the way of an ice sheet. You just can't do it. Whether or not CO2 will help us to maybe avoid some of that, maybe. But those are the real things we've got to worry about, but they're much longer term out. The point is that the climate of the Earth, while it has been relatively stable during the Holocene, has had periods where it dips and goes into cold periods for millennia. And that then is a real concern for the survivability of the human race. And those are things we need to look at. We need to understand why those happen and what, if anything, we can do to avoid it. But we also need to be thinking about whether or not what we're doing right now is really having that much of an impact. And that's what I think a lot of people are coming to realize right now. Our predictions were bold for a number of years, you know, like Hansen's predictions and so forth, and predictions of Arctic being ice-free and that sort of thing. But now those are coming to be, well, maybe not so. Maybe not as bad as we thought. And that goes all the way back to climate sensitivity. Until we fully understand climate sensitivity, we can't really make good predictions about what the climate's going to do. And right now, I don't think that there's a scientist out there that could say he fully, completely understands the climate system down to every level. Yeah. Clouds are a big factor. Yeah. Cosmic rays are the question hanging in the air. Do they affect it or not? You know, ocean currents, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, that has a big role, and it was only discovered into the 90s. And that was discovered due to fish hatchery, or not fish hatchery, but fish catch changes in the North Pacific. They weren't looking for this climate phenomena. It came about by looking at fish catches. And so climate science finally goes, oh, there's this thing. So there's lots of things we haven't discovered yet. And until we have a better understanding of the climate system, we really can't attribute it to certain things. Even the journal Nature has said this in an editorial that they produced last year. They said that better models are needed in order to be able to attribute weather events, severe weather events, for example, to climate change. They said you just can't do it. The IPCC in their SREX report said exactly the same thing. You can't attribute severe weather events to climate change because there's just not the connective science yet there. It may be at some point, but really not right now. And the trends show we've had a reduction in the number of tornadoes, tornado damage, the number of hurricanes is down. Severe weather in general isn't as bad as what was originally thought it would be under a rising temperature scenario. But there's this perception that the weather is getting worse. And I understand this, being on television, because I used to take calls from people all the time on television, you know, there's a thunderstorm over here, or there's a tornado over here. I'd get these calls all the time. And I understand that concern, but what's happened is that we've gone from a society that was slow motion information transfer up until around 1950 to one that's instantaneous. You can pick up a cell phone right now, snap a picture of a tornado, send it to CNN, and it's on the air in 5 minutes. 30 years ago, you couldn't do that. And so with that advent of technology, with that instant news gathering out there, there's the impression that there are more tornadoes, more hurricanes, more hailstones of giant size, things of that nature, because people can report them easily where they couldn't 30 years ago.
So what is actually happening? What does the scientific data tell us about storm frequency and intensity, about these various things that we should see if climate change were happening, if we were seeing rising temperatures? What does the actual data show?
The actual data shows that severe weather, for the most part, is on the downturn. Tornadoes, the number of tornadoes are reduced, the number of strong tornadoes is reduced, the number of small tornadoes has actually increased, but that has to do with technology again. Doppler radar, introduced in 1990, allows us to see smaller F1 and F0 type tornadoes that we couldn't even notice before. It's kind of like there's a tree fall in the forest, do you hear it? Well, in the middle of Kansas, if a tornado happens in the middle of a cornfield and no one's around to see it, is it logged in the database? Now they see those things with Doppler radar, and they do get logged in the database. So smaller tornadoes are on the increase thanks to technology. But severe tornadoes, the big ones, they are actually on the downturn. Even though we've had in the last couple of years a couple of major events that have been publicized, the trend is still down.
A lot of noise is being made at the moment about ocean acidification and the warming of the oceans. What do we know from a data point of view about what's happening in the oceans?
There was a graph published on my blog just today, just literally 5 hours ago from this interview, that showed the flux input and output of the ocean heat system. And it showed virtually a flat trend over the last 60 years. And this is the forcings trend, whether we had more forcings going in or forcings going out. The ocean heat content issue is one that's, that they're saying, well, all the heat's going to the ocean. But when we look at the data, it doesn't show it, at least by the data that we're looking at right now. The ocean acidification thing is a bit of a misnomer. Anyone who's taken basic science in grade school or high school understands the concept of pH for measurement of acidity and alkalinity. pH of 7 is considered neutral. Well, the oceans are still basic. They're above 7. They are not acidic yet. Yet there's this way it is presented in the media that they're turning acidic. Well, they're becoming less basic. We're talking about tenths of a point shifts here. We're not talking about wholesale shifts. We aren't having sea life dissolving in the oceans or anything like that yet. And so, yes, there's some of it, but a lot of it is hype. A lot of it is overhyped, and that's the biggest problem we're facing with climate science right now. Claims are being overhyped, but the reality, when you study it in detail, doesn't quite match it.
All right, Anthony, just wanting to move on now to the issue of carbon trading schemes, carbon taxes, emissions trading schemes, these various mechanisms that politicians, scientists, bureaucrats and so forth around the world are trying to introduce in order to stop climate change. That's the goal. The stated goal is that we need these schemes in order to reduce our carbon emissions so that we can limit the degree of climate change and save ourselves from the consequences of runaway climate change. What's your understanding of what's being proposed? How effective is it? How much of a difference can we make, and should we be doing it?
Well, carbon trading, I believe, was first proposed back in the early to late 90s by Gore and some of his folks, who were very big into the trading of securities and so forth. Some of his business now is associated with that. And the idea is that if you put some kind of a cap or a limit on carbon by introducing a cap and trade scheme or a carbon credit scheme, that it would work much like the scheme that we have in place for pollution credits for things like sulfur dioxide and things and soot and things like that for power plants. Problem is, it doesn't really work out that way, and the carbon trading that's been tried, at least here in the United States so far, has failed miserably. For example, the Chicago Climate Exchange basically flatlined at one point. It was down to about a nickel per ton of value at one point before it closed. Now, carbon trading is still trying to be tried by California, by the California Air Resources Board, and they're looking at prices that are around $20 to $30 a ton. In Europe right now, There's the trading of carbon going on a daily basis, and it's trading around $4.50 in EU per ton right now. Well, the problem with that is that it's not realistic, it's not tangible. It's not like buying wheat futures or something where you're actually buying, a ton of wheat or a ton of pork bellies or whatever. It's a non-tangible thing with these carbon credits. That and the fact that the price difference between carbon credits and real carbon is wildly different. For example, this is a bag of charcoal briquettes. It cost about $8 for 8 pounds. Now compare that to $4.50 a ton for carbon in the air, supposedly. It's not tangible, and it's wildly out of whack. I mean, a bag of charcoal briquettes per pound is worth more than a ton of carbon credits. So where's the logic in that?
All right, so what's happening with these schemes now? I mean, you mentioned that the Chicago scheme shut down. The European scheme is trading far below expectations. I know, being from Australia, the Australian scheme is currently trading at a set price, which is far in excess of any of the free market or any of the openly traded schemes at the moment. And I think it's fair to assume at this point that when the Australian scheme is floated, that the price will probably correct more in line with what we're seeing in other markets. What are the implications of this? Are we actually seeing a reduction in carbon emissions as a result of these schemes?
I can't answer that question because I can't find any tangible evidence that it is or it isn't. I would generally think that any kind of a tax can't really affect much. People that want things, they want energy, they want to be able to drive, they want to do things with energy, are going to find ways to do that. And if they have to pay a little more for it to be able to go visit grandma on Christmas by driving cross country, well, they're going to do that. So the tax really isn't going to stop them from doing that sort of an activity. It's just going to make it harder for them to do so. And then where does that money go and what does it do? How does it affect the atmosphere? There's a big disconnect there.
What about green subsidies, renewable energy, these sorts of things? California, of course, is the home of some of the world's most ambitious wind farm type arrangements. Are these good ways to go? Should we be pushing in the direction of renewable energy?
Well, subsidies were tried to make these changes palatable, but they're having an opposite effect in some areas. I mean, for example, there's been millions and billions put into subsidies for solar panels. I have solar panels on my house, full disclosure. Now, I didn't get them with subsidies. I paid for them out of my own pocket. But there are some people that are doing them because the subsidies were making it palatable, and they're getting basically a free home improvement upgrade, and they're getting a value to their house upgrade thanks to the government subsidy. The problem is we're all paying for that, and so we're paying to make someone else's house more valuable through taxes. Is it fair? Some people say yes it is, others say no. But the point is that here in California, for example, it's no longer really being subsidized very much. But now, for example, my own solar panels, I put in place not because I thought it was going to reduce CO2 or because I thought I was saving the planet or anything like that. I'm putting it in as a survival issue because electricity now during the summer is getting up to 40 cents a kilowatt hour. And the amount of money you have to pay to maintain a livable lifestyle in Central California, where it gets pretty hot, up to 100 to 110 on a regular basis, and has for millennia, now is becoming difficult to pay those bills. So solar panels are one way that you can maintain your standard of living, and that's what I did, and that's what many people are doing now. They're using it as a way to fight against rising electricity prices, but it's a catch-22 there. The electricity prices are going up because of green subsidies and so forth that are being put into those electricity prices. And so we're paying for this in many ways, and it's making it unfair for a lot of people. It's going to particularly affect the poor. The poor can't afford electricity in some cases, and they turn off their heat or they turn off their cooling, and they suffer the most. And so I see it as kind of a disproportionate class tax where the rich can survive it, maybe most of the upper middle class can survive it, but the lower class, not so much.
It's interesting you say that because when in Australia we had our carbon tax introduced, it was introduced alongside family assistance, financial family assistance. that was actually meant to outweigh the increased costs. So the actual assistance being offered to your average Australian household was supposed to exceed the cost of the Australian carbon tax. So it was actually a tax that would cost money rather than make money. And of course the question then becomes, if it doesn't hurt people, if it doesn't hit the hip pocket, then will it change their behaviour? Will it actually achieve anything from a carbon reduction point of view? And well, at the moment the evidence seems to be no, but I'll let the experts go on the hard numbers on all of that. So where does that leave us then? We have politicians who are pushing ahead with these schemes. If these schemes aren't really working, if in some cases they're actually having perverse effects and having negative effects, how do we deal with that? What do we need to do? I mean, you're out in the public space with a blog and educating people on all of the scientific issues, and you're very much into the hard data and the numbers behind all of this. But how do we translate that into the real world? How do we get from knowing now that climate change and the emission of CO2 isn't doing the harm that we were told previously that it was going to do? How do we get that into public policy? How do we get from here, where do we go?
Let's assume for a moment that climate change is the greatest issue facing mankind. And some people say that. And we have to do something about it. Now, what's the best way to go about it? Have people emit less? Well, that's one way. Tax them to force them to emit less? Well, it might be effective, but probably not. I think the way forward is through efficiency. We can gain improvements in efficiency that will, for the short term, reduce carbon emissions, if they are indeed a problem, and will benefit us in terms of lower energy cost. And by the time that we get to the point, let's say 100 years from now, where people say, oh, we're going to have a doubling of temperature, or a tripling of temperature, or a quadrupling of temperature, whatever their scenario is, 100 years from now, are we going to be burning coal? Are we going to be using fossil fuels that much? Maybe not. I mean, there's things like thorium, for example. If we were to embrace a program on thorium as opposed to uranium for nuclear reactors, we would be able to solve many of our problems associated with electricity generation based on thorium without the problems associated with things like, radioactive waste and storage of radioactive waste. Because thorium doesn't produce all those nasty different types of isotopes that uranium fission does. And right now the Chinese are actually working on thorium. They've started the thorium reactor program. And we've had the technology since the late 40s, early 50s to do this. But we got steered off in the direction of uranium because it paralleled the bomb making process. You're making bombs, well, we can also make reactor uranium for it. And so that's how it ended up down the uranium path, and thorium got ignored. If we were to shift to thorium, improve our efficiency, work on new technologies, we wouldn't need to be taxing carbon.
So technology is essentially the way forward as you see it.
Technology is the way forward, and I think for right now we just have to have the courage to just sit it out and not freak out about it, not worry that every tornado that we see reported on the news is caused by climate change, because it isn't. Just maintain a sense of calm and move forward. The Chinese are doing this. They have a long-term plan, and they're not fools. They've been around far longer than we have. They're going to take this, and they're going to do it pragmatically. I just think we need to stop being so worried and just take a pragmatic approach to increasing efficiency, improving our energy production, and going down different pathways for energy production. And we'll get to where people say we should be without having to tax people and without having to change our lifestyles in a negative way.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Anthony. Before we finish up, is there anything that we haven't covered that is burning a hole in the back of your mind that you'd really like to put down on this interview?
I think that in the question of climate change and carbon dioxide, Mother Nature is really going to be the final arbiter of truth in this matter.
Anthony, thank you very much.